So it's, it's just cost to value type thing. So
points per game, we got to talk about that. So I agree. I think points per game is more indicative than finishing out entire season and saying, oh, you were the RB 15 or whatever it is. I think it's more indicative of that. But I also think people use that to a fault because they're like, oh, if he would have played a full season, this would have happened, right? And we've seen that in spurts too, where if we'd have used points per game and Travis Etienne would have got hurt last year in week 9, we wouldn't have seen the full season pan out. We'd have been like, oh, Travis Etienne would have been a top X back over those seasons. Same thing with you look at some of the other players. If CeeDee Lamb would have got hurt before week 4, we'd have been talking about him entirely differently than we did. So I also think finishing out a season, there's something to be said about having durability.
No, I agree.
And I agree with you. I agree that's indicative, but I also think that narrative has been spinned way too much at just looking at fantasy points per game. I've seen it a lot on Twitter too, where it's like, oh, I look at that over season. Yeah. There's value in finishing out a season.
I think fantasy football is just so complicated that you got to just take in. There's so much that you got to take in. You can't look at one stat. Like it's just a piggyback because there's just so much. Like every situation is just so different, and it's not the same. So no, I agree that you can't just piggyback off of just fantasy points per game. No, I agree 100% with that. So
it's a good stat. I'm not saying I agree with you, but I just want to put that out there in the verse, in the YouTube verse or wherever this is at verse, and that don't make that the only anchor, because a lot of people, I think they hear that and they're like, oh, that's the stat I'm going to look at instead of finishing out a season. And I'm like, some players are good in spurts and some players are meant to finish out an entire season as well.
When I think people run into that trap, especially when you're looking at like, oh, for weeks 4 and 6, or 4 through 8, he was averaging 23 fantasy points per game. Man, he could be that player. Yeah. Like kind of like we were doing with Justin Fields. And I will admit, I love Justin Fields just because of rushing upside. But like we were looking at Justin Fields and saying, man, he finished off the season averaging 25 fantasy points per game. That would have been, quarterback one. Well, he didn't play the full season. So it's hard to extrapolate that. And I think a lot of people will do that, where they look at the data and they'll say, oh my gosh, he could average 25 fantasy points per game because he did it for 4 weeks. That's not how it usually works, like you said. So don't fall into that trap. I will say that. I agree with that.
Hopefully I'm not burning you, Tyler, in the process. And if I am, my bad. But Elijah Moore was this player a couple of years ago at the back end of that Jet season. Everybody was like, oh, he's the next Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you look at what he did over the last 4 games, and it doesn't always translate, man. No. It's just one of those things where it's tough. I get it. It's easy to get excited about somebody's points per game. You're like, man, but that's also a limited stretch. We don't always remember what defense is. We don't always remember situation, what time of the season that it is. Like, there's a lot that goes into that. So that's my only caution with it.
What I'll say with Elijah Moore, that was a little bit different, and I agree with you. But like, because one thing that is important is with rookies is that you always see the second half breakout season with rookies. Like it's much different for the first half compared to the second half. And a lot of those times, that's why those guys end up being league winners down the stretch, because they're just able to go onto the scene. But like, it should have been clear. And this is kind of like a thing that I'm learning. And I think it's also like what the fantasy football community is learning. Like if a wide receiver has a good second half of the season, like as a rookie, and then year 2, they don't do shit. Like usually what that means is like that player is probably not very good. And Elijah Moore, so like Sky Moore, like I was big on Sky Moore last year, and you learn that just like he didn't do shit as rookie. That's why I'm completely. I didn't like Quentin Johnston last year, anyways. Coming into the draft, I just didn't think he was a good prospect. I'm totally out on him, but there's still some people holding out hope for him. He was used differently. I just don't think he's very good. Jonathan Mingo, same sense. Like they didn't do shit last year, and they had all the opportunity in the world to do something and didn't do something. So, but you can also go, well, same with Nico Collins. So I don't know, like it can, but that's kind of what I'm learning here.
It's tough, and there's no right or wrong answer.
No,
fantasy. I think that's what people expect from us, right? Is to put out content that's right or wrong on a consistent basis, and there's a lot of variables, and so I think you got to be able to put yourself in position, and just kind of seeing that trend you talked about with Quentin Johnston and with Jonathan Mingo. It's easy, like just avoid it. You don't have to be right or wrong about it. Just take yourself out of the equation. I think I'm more there with Mingo than I am with Quentin Johnston. I think there's a little hope for him, but that could just be me looking at the frame, looking at draft pedigree, and kind of taking that side of it, right? The side that says, historically, these guys have a role on a team at some point. Could be 100% wrong on that. So I like him
He's going a lot
he's
cheaper this year,
variables.
anyways, too. Quinn
Yeah, you get him
Johnston
for
is.
free.
Yeah, so it's not you're not paying like last year. I think it was like 7th, 8th round
Yeah, it
draft
was high.
capital. So he's basically free. And same with Jonathan Mingo. I just highly doubt that works out. But